given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, the last couple of episodes of our live stream, we always get a question about what should I do as a female, or actually just as a staff member, because it's not always just females, when an inmate decides to show their penis to you. So a little bit of an exhibitionist type behavior, the exposure. And I think it's serious enough to where we want to devote a whole video to it, only because some of the practices that some of these staff members are doing, thinking that it's correct and that it will deter the behavior, is actually just the opposite. So having the dialogue yesterday and then making the decision today is really an effort to make sure that we get the right advice out there. But also there's other things that you may not be aware of that we're also going to add. So this dialogue is going to talk about that course of action, some course of action for management. But I also have Gary on as well as Connie. But Gary is going to focus on, can we prosecute? You know, that's a good question. You know, we're talking about exhibitionist type behavior. I mean, is this behavior that we would allow in the streets? Of course not. So why do we allow it inside the prisons? Now, guys, the show is sponsored by American Military University. Guys, if you are looking to go back to school and let's bring experience back into the classrooms, American Military University. Guys, if you get a chance, check out their website. They've been supporting us since day one. Corrections since day one. And also Guardian RFID. From inmate tracking and cell checks to cloud-based business and artificial intelligence, Guardian RFID digitally transforms jails, prisons, and juvenile detention facilities of every size. Visit guardianrfid.com for more information. Before I introduce the two guests, don't forget, I'll be posting up a video tomorrow night. Me, Connie, Russ, Brian Kovacs, I believe the other gentleman's name is Carlos Garcia, and we're going to be talking about one of the leaked videos that came out of Arizona and how, you know, the safety and security. Like, basically, we're going to talk about what needs to be done. We are going to literally break down the video, and hopefully we're doing an effort for people to listen. That's all we need. Just get the right people to listen, get the right people to ask the right amount of questions, and hopefully we'll provide enough in the video where it can help get some action for our brave warriors out there in Arizona. Connie, author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Connie Alleyne. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I'm also the podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall and the author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon. This question comes around more often than not. And I know I've been asked the question just in general many times. And, you know, I think, yes, based on even yesterday's exchange, it really does make sense that we do a quick discussion about it. So I'm looking forward to us sort of clearing the air on this penis exposure.
Hey, guys, this isn't our regular day. It's supposed to be Tuesdays and Thursdays, but it was so important that me, Connie, and Gary decided that we want to get out there now because you never know. It could be happening right now. So hopefully the right people watch this video and then commit to the right course of action. And as I mentioned already, we have the author of Corruption Behind Bars and a new book called The Toughest Job, Gary York. What's up, Gary?
Hello, Anthony. Hello, Connie. Nice to be with you again. I'm Gary York. I retired from corrections in the state of Florida. I worked both the state prison side and the jail side, a total of 28.8 years. I have a new book out called The Toughest Job, which talks about a lot of these things that officers have to put up with while doing their job on a daily basis. Anthony, this is a good topic. This topic is so strong that our IG office supervisors actually went to the state attorneys. My area covered like 8 counties. So 8 different state attorneys' office to try to work something out to get these folks prosecuted that show their penis or ejaculate in front of officers. And I know we're going to talk about it, but Thank you for having me on. It's a very important topic that I wish we could get tough on.
Yeah. Now, what I want to do first, guys, before we get into the topic. Oh wait, what guys? By the way, Inmate Manipulation Decoded, available on the market. You can get it through Amazon and Target. Go figure. Target now has decided to sell online only. They don't want me in stores just yet, but they are selling Inmate Manipulation Decoded. I still don't understand how I get paid from it yet. I'm just kind of living off the fact that Target's got my book, so I may make no money off it, but it doesn't matter. Target's got the book, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not going to become a millionaire, but I think it's pretty cool. So I want to go over something really quick before we kind of dive into what needs to be done. So before we talk about the actions that staff should take, I want to mention something of the actions that staff do not want to take. So during the live stream yesterday, one of the female staff members, she's been dealing with this. It's been an ongoing issue. So she wrote up this great question about, basically she wanted to know if she was handling it the right way, which basically started this dialogue, a great discussion as to, whoa, the way you're doing it isn't the right way. And then that kind of flowed into what the right way was. The concern here was that, and I get it, by the way, so hear me out first. Remember, guys, these are new people entering the profession. So the inmate that keeps on exposing their penis to this officer, the officer says, well, you know what? If I just don't pay attention to it, it's going to go away. And I know maybe in the real world, that's what we're taught. Stop paying attention to things and it disappears. Not in the prison. The moment you ignore it, it's like you're allowing it to happen. You have to literally, with that level of authority that you have to direct that inmate and make the inmate know that the behavior is not to be tolerated. Because the problem is if you ignore it, in their mind, it becomes acceptable. Plus, the other inmates that see you ignore it also may start to believe it's acceptable. Now, when you're coming to work and you go to work in that unit, it's going to be more than one inmate that's going to decide to expose their genitals or their penis. Same thing as a compliment. Inmate gives you a compliment. You don't ignore it. You don't accept it. You tell them how the comment's inappropriate. And then I'll tell you what the action is. Because I want to kind of stay on this first part first. So I'm going to go with Connie first. Connie, before we talk about the course of action, the one thing I was just discussing now is that you don't ignore it. I want people to know that's not the right course of action. You do not ignore the inmate pulling out their genitals and showing. You have to address it. But why for some of those staff members that believe it's okay to ignore it, that kind of gets the message out there, why do you think that's not the message to get out there?
So I think what we want to first address is why people ignore it, right? So it is a very uncomfortable experience, especially if it's your first time experiencing that in the environment. So I wouldn't say that people think it's okay to ignore it. I think it's like that nervous energy. It's that I'm not sure, it's almost like sort of rattles you a little bit. It's a little unnerving because you don't expect that to happen, right? So I think that there are times where people might think, let me just ignore it because it'll go away. And I think the reality is that doesn't go away, right? That is just when you respond in that manner, it isn't sending the message to the inmate that it will go away or he'll stop or just stop because she's ignoring you, right? When that happens, one, and you don't say anything, I'm kind of feeling as though the inmate is getting the message, not even just so much that it's okay, but he has the power to have or to get a rise, to get a response from you. And that response is making you feel uncomfortable in your professional space. So it's even more important to not ignore it because you don't want to give that sort of leverage in this particular situation.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. Right off the bat, I think how inmates interpret you ignoring it is the same as they would interpret you allowing it and accepting it. I know it may sound crazy, guys, but it's true because in this world, believe it or not, the inmates should expect some action. You know, they expect that to not be tolerated. So what that does is when you don't react to it, when you kind of ignore it, it makes it show like, okay, well, this person is also not talking to their peers. They're not telling them, because I'll guarantee you, if they decide to show their penis to a female officer, I'll guarantee you the moment they tell a male officer or the other officers that are next to them, oh, there's going to be a swift course of action, or there should be. When they tell their supervisor, there should be a swift course of action. But Gary, same question about why do you think people choose to ignore it, just to get your perspective.
Well, number one, just as bad as ignoring it, is as disgusting as it is and as shocking as it is, don't act shocked, don't act surprised, don't go, oh my God, because that's what the inmates want. They want to get you shook up. They want to get a rise out of you, and they'll laugh and they think that's funny. So don't ignore it, but stay as calm as you can. And it may shock you on the inside, but don't show that it shocks you on the outside. And if you ignore the situation or act shocked every time you see it, you will be labeled by the inmates as an officer that is going to be gunned. You know, they call them gunners. They'll show you their penis. They'll ejaculate in front of you, and you don't want to give those inmates 1 millimeter of room to do this. And I don't know if you're ready yet, Anthony. I'll wait till after you talk as far as what we can do to stop them.
Yeah. So and I appreciate that, Gary and Connie. So right off the bat, let me just put it out there. You do not ignore. There has to be a reaction that shows that you do not tolerate it. There has to be a zero tolerant reaction. Now, by the way, and we'll get to it, the zero tolerant reaction is not just from the officer who has gotten exposed, but also from their supervisors, from the higher level. I would like to go as far, and we'll get with that with Gary later on. Prosecution, why not, right? You do it on the streets. It's unacceptable there. It's unacceptable in here. So again, there's going to be multiple tiers of zero tolerance. So everybody's going to play a role in this. So when we start this discussion, we're going to go frontline first, and then the management side, and then go a little higher than that. And let's see what happens if we can forward this out. So the first thing I want to mention, and what I'll do in all fairness is, I don't want to go, because there's really only one swift course of action. But even as we say it, it's good to kind of say these 3 times, right? Because it gets into your head. But I promise you, you may be hearing the course of action 3 times, but there's a different perspective, and there's going to be different reasons why you're going to take those courses of action. So mind you, maybe a little bit repetitive, but bear with me. Each person on this panel is going to present it in a different way that's meant for you to get in this thought, because there's really only one course of action you can take. This is not really up for debate. So it's a very definitive dialogue that gets you from A to B. But maybe we'll show you some different sites along the way, depending on, you know, how we get to B. But my thing right off the bat is, when you see it, automatic reaction, if you can, if the environment allows that. But again, the idea is to make sure the inmate knows you don't tolerate that. So you got to document it. Document, charge the inmate, notify your supervisors. And the reason why you're doing all this, by the way, is because if this inmate thinks it's okay to expose you, let's say, you may not be the first person they exposed. You may not be the last person they expose. But every person that inmate exposes themselves to, they should make it as best they can that you will be that last person they expose. You know, so you got to do whatever you can, which includes is that documentation, that, you know, that charge, you know, making sure that it's on record that this inmate did this. Now, if it's safe to do so, the inmate is, let's say, locked in their cell and they can't get to you and you could see it, you know, you can address it loud enough so everybody can hear it, you know, and be professional in response. You know, you want to make sure that the inmate knows that their behavior is not to be tolerated. Having said that, there are some female officers or staff members that could get exposed in a dorm. Got to be careful on how you react at that point, you know, because you're in a dorm. There's not a lot of barriers between you and that inmate. But that doesn't mean, all because you don't react in the moment, doesn't mean you're not going to react. You're going to go back to where you got to go. You're going to get your supervisor, you're going to get your peers, and you're going to have a controlled reaction. But at the end of the day, the key is that they're going to know that what their action did was not tolerated. But I'm going to end on this part before I give it to Connie. Document, and let it be known that behavior is not tolerated. And the documentation is to also start getting that history in. If this is more than the inmate's first time, well, I want to know how many times this person does it, because there's something else that management can do, and we'll get to that. But in the meantime, document how many times, it was done. It's going to show the history of the inmate if everybody's doing their job and documenting it. And it also shows the inmate that there is a consequence. But the key here is it also shows others. It shows all the inmates around them that this behavior is not to be tolerated. So again, my part is, you got to let them know by whatever means and however aggressive as possible that this behavior is not to be tolerated. Okay, Connie.
Yeah, so the not to be tolerated is, I think that's really just the understatement, right? Because when we don't respond in a bold sort of way, right? Like if we're almost hesitant to respond, that in of itself also sends a message, right? So you see something, you say something, you nip it in the bud immediately, because it also shows that you're not being thrown off kilter by this action. I mean, I think the other thing, which, Anthony, you and I talked about, is if they feel that they could have their penis out in front of you or they're ejaculating in front of you, like if they're able to get hands on you, does that mean that they feel that they can take this further with you because you haven't stopped it? Because I don't want to say you welcomed it, right? Because you didn't, but it could be interpreted as she's okay with it, right? And so to even stop that thought process of I can take this even further with this person, you want to make sure that you are stopping whatever is happening and doing it consistently, because it can't be okay for one and not okay for another, right? As you're doing your tours, I know one of the experiences I had when we were on Rikers, they wore the gray jumpers, and these dudes were notorious for not wearing boxers underneath the gray jumper. And then, of course, the Velcro never stays closed. And then I have to deal with this kind of foolishness. And I would actually end the encounter. You got to get out. You can't tell me that was a mistake, right? Because you knew that you were coming here. You came without having an undergarment on, and you allowed for your jumper to open, right? So I'm just saying, like, this is one of those things that as a person, you have to have zero tolerance for. And you never know how you taking a stand is going to prevent that inmate from doing the same thing to another staff person. So it's always just understanding that there is a ripple effect when you accept it, as well as when you nip it in the bud.
Yeah, and I love what you said, because that falls right into the documentation, showing the history of that individual. I mean, that's the key too, and also, believe it or not, the more you document, the more you start pushing it towards the agency as well. What are you doing to stop it now? Like, okay, we're doing what we can. The officer's doing their job, or that staff member's doing their job. They're documenting it, and they're holding that inmate responsible. But is management holding the inmate responsible? I mean, because that's going to be the next step. I mean, all we could do is document, but what is management doing? Hey, Gary, what would be your advice at this point? I mean, the documentation, that history, I mean, what would be kind of leaning into what me and Connie were saying?
Well, we always say document inmate threats. We teach that. We write about it. We tell about it. And is this not a threat? Just because the inmate is behind a cell door or bars and they can't touch you right at that moment, that's still a threat. And as Connie mentioned, which is very important, if you don't do anything about it now, will that little threat that just happened, it's really not a little threat to me, it's a big threat, because they're telling you they don't respect anybody. They're telling you they don't respect authority, and probably don't respect females. That's what they're telling you. They're sending you all these messages when they do that. So you need to nip it in the butt and document it. Because what happens when there is no cell door between the two of you and that inmate decides to carry it further and touch you? What happens when you just happen to be over in a corner of the dorm where nobody can see and that inmate decides to grab you? It's happened before, and it starts out with that little thing of showing their penis, and it will grow into a big cancer if you don't document it and take action and let them know that you mean business.
Yeah, and you crossed into something great, Gary, that is going to get to the next part. So, guys, this is the follow-up. Now, a lot of the people from Frontline may not be aware of this. I mean, at that point, they got to get that documentation across. They want to get that history out there. But again, they want to show that there's zero tolerance. Like what Connie said, you know, you're not welcoming behavior. What are you doing to show them that the behavior is unwelcome? So at this point, management also has to play a role. Because I'm going to tell you something. Eventually, these people get released. So you have an inmate that has a history of doing this. Right off the bat, do we have an inmate that needs to be civilly committed? Are we referring that inmate to mental health for a risk assessment? So we don't just now, you know, release this inmate back to the public with the same type of behavior. Like Gary said, being an exhibition is usually the first step to something larger and greater. You know, this person could be a sexual predator. So with that said, you know, they may think it's all fun and games and, you know, yeah, I'm going to do this all day to this officer and looks like no one's doing anything about it. Oh, we're doing something. Because that day when you go to get released, oh, what do you mean I'm not going home? No, you're getting committed. You're going to a mental health ward. Sorry, but every time you pulled out your junk, which we have here listed every time, you know, it's not good. Because right now, mental health is thinking that you're not ready to go outside because you pose a risk. So that's the management follow-up. You get all these documentations. You build that history. You refer that over to mental health. They do a risk assessment. And at that point, they can make a determination if this person, what are we going to do with this person? Here's another thing, guys. That determination also helps us with housing that individual. What about, let's talk about the inmates for a second. You get a person like this with a clear amount of exposures. Is that someone that you want to put next to someone who's vulnerable, like a transgender inmate? No. This inmate is building a history of sexual aggressive behavior. So the last thing you want to do is when you have that history is put that inmate next to a vulnerable inmate that they could take advantage of. So that documentation doesn't just serve staff, it serves the facility as a whole. And that risk assessment is a preventive measure that one helps us control the concerns inside the facility, but also helps us control what could be a problem once released. Connie, would you agree with that mental health assessment with that repetitive behavior?
Yeah, I mean, so when you think about everything that leads to the designation of someone being a sexual predator, right? It is all of that documentation. You know, you do that risk assessment because that essentially what we're saying is that person has poor impulse control and they're not able to control themselves out in the community. If they're doing this here, where it's a controlled setting, and they know that there are consequences to the behavior, but they can't stop themselves from doing it, what's to prevent them from escalating in the community? And that always has to be a serious consideration before letting someone out. And I mean, when we think about the liability that's attached to that, right? So how is it as an institution, would we possibly let someone out for whom we've had all this documentation without actually going forward and doing the risk assessment to make sure that this person will not be a danger to themselves or others?
Right. And then Gary, I don't think a lot of people follow up with that risk assessment. And then obviously we're going to get to your part next, but do you believe that's something that management should be doing?
Absolutely. They need to be assessed. They need to have a mental health evaluation. It needs to be documented for future, if we need to try to get them through the court system for prosecution. All this is very important to the final decision if we do go to prosecution. So yes, and it's also important, as you mentioned, for classification, so we know where to put this individual and protect other inmates. It's also about protecting other inmates. And you brought up a great point when you said we need to know everything about them. We need to classify them correctly and evaluate them, because it's also about where do we put them to keep them from causing trouble within the prison.
Yeah, and as I said, guys, it's a tool. I don't think a lot of people actually follow up with that. I'm going to put that more on management. I mean, you're collecting all these documents from your staff, but what are you doing now with those documents? I mean, again, you got this history, you got this person that likes to constantly do it. And the funny thing is, sometimes these inmates, maybe they are sexual predators. I would like to think so with that behavior, but sometimes they think it's funny, it's games. Oh yeah, well, you're going to laugh on that last day when you're getting committed. So I'll guarantee you guys, if anything, that's definitely going to deter that behavior. The moment they get interviewed by mental health and they start talking about the multiple times they've done the exposures, and now this is what we're looking at. So you may have had fun and games with your boys and everybody thinks this is all a good time, but we've been working stuff behind the scenes, and guess what? Day's coming for you to go. Truck's coming to pick you up, brother. You know, you made some bad choices, and you know, they could figure it out, you know, when you're at that mental health institution, if it was a joke or not. And that's a great way to exit the facility, right? I mean, just when you're supposed to get that good start, that's when all the fun and games that you're having start to catch up. But that's the control that we have and we should have. But again, but look at the partnership here. Let me just advertise that one more time. Frontline, management, working together. Frontline and management working together. So I want to go with Gary first, then Connie, because I want to get to this last part, which is the prosecution part. Everything we said is obviously what you're going to need to push it to the highest level, right? So we talked about it in the right order, right? The documentation, the history, the risk assessment. We're going above and beyond here. Now, I know if this was done on the streets, person would be held accountable in the prison. It's crazy, but I feel like it's behavior that's accepted, which is horrible. It should be just the same as if it was on the streets. But Gary, do you think that these should be prosecuted? And if you do, what are some of the measures that we need to take as an agency to make sure that these inmates that do it are prosecuted?
Yes, and just to say one thing about what you just said, let's think like an inmate for a minute. When you said they're taken out and transferred to a mental facility, they're removed from the dorm, what are their inmates saying now? They're saying to each other, man, dude, don't do that. They just took Johnny out of here, and they tried to commit him to the mental health institution. They gave him a DR. They shipped him out of here. You've sent a big message. So what you just said, Anthony, sends a big message to the inmates, and they're all talking now about what happened to Johnny when he did that, and it helps slow it down. Believe me, it's not going to stop it 100%, but it slows it way down. As far as prosecution, we want the prosecutors to prosecute, and we've run into some trouble with that here in Florida. We found that we run into more trouble with the big cities like Tampa and Miami. They have so many cases going through their system, and they always say, well, can't your agency just handle that administratively? And then we have some rural state attorneys in not very big towns that were very welcoming to prosecute these inmates. But our argument was we can't just have a few counties prosecuting. We want everybody to be on the same sheet of music and prosecute these inmates. Now, if you can get the state attorneys to prosecute these cases, you have to have your documentation. Of course, write your incident report, get your supervisor, turn that incident report in.
Hey, Gary, can I just mention something? I want to make sure you don't overlook. You just said something so key that I want to make sure we don't overlook it. That's the problem with the lack of consistency. That's why, depending on that prosecutor, you could work at a facility that is on point because the prosecutor is doing their job. Or like you said, you can work at a facility that's connected to, like, let's say, a bigger area where they flooded with cases, and the culture of that facility is for shit because no one's chasing up at it. So think about just what Gary said. You're going to have one facility where no one's chasing after, so these staff members are getting exposed all the time, or you get that one facility that says, I'm going to make an example, and it doesn't happen again. I thought that was a great point, Gary. I didn't mean to cut you off, but go ahead.
No. Thanks for confirming that, because it is important that we stay consistent. And all the documents you do will end up in that court, including mental health documents, because if mental health says, hey, this is a possible sex predator, or, I'm not a mental health expert, Connie is, there's terminology they'll use. All these things will be taken into the state attorney's reference and for their final decision on whether to prosecute or not. And if we can get some inmates prosecuted for this crime, because it is a crime, If it happens on the street, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be put in jail, you're going to be prosecuted. Pretty much automatic, right? On the street. Why can't it be automatic when it happens in the prison system? Now, I want to tell you one thing. When we've had state attorneys say they're not going to prosecute, you as an officer, if you want to, on your off-duty time, can go down to the state attorney and make a visit. And you can tell them again, I'm a victim of this inmate exposing their penis, ejaculating in front of me, especially if any body fluids get on you or were projected towards you. Okay, this can run into more crimes. And you can say, hey, I'm doing this as a citizen now. I want this inmate prosecuted. It has worked in some cases. I'm just throwing some things out there. I'm not saying any of this is solid and it'll happen, but there's things you can do. We can work together to fight this. The agency and the frontline staff, the agency management, frontline staff need to work hard together. And then you on your own can go out there and push it even more.
Yeah, and I want to add something too. When you become a victim of this and you write your report, you have to make sure that you highlight that the behavior was purposeful and that it was directed at you. Gary kind of hit on something because, again, you got to be prepared that people are going to come up with arguments against it. You know, the person was pissing, or now with Priya, you got to announce yourself before you come down. Yeah, it's just, but you got to show and be honest with those reports that the behavior was purposeful. They did it. They looked right at me. They said this remark, whatever it is. So it makes it harder for them to defend that bullshit behavior that they're doing.
And can I just add to that? You also want to make sure that you add in there the impact that it had on you. It's not like this person did this and then you just felt like, great, I'll just go back to post, no big deal, right? Like, I think that a lot of times we don't want to highlight, whether like the way this thing has offended you or the way it made you feel or the impact that this event had on you or that it continues to have on you because it keeps happening, right? Like, because I think we tend to kind of brush those feelings aside a little bit because we're not supposed to be so affected by these events that happen. But our reality is that now, as a female, have I built this fear? Does this make me ineffective in any way in doing my job, right? Like, do I no longer tour on that side, leaving a vulnerability because I'm afraid of having to have this experience again? And I think when we start to put those things in there and really express how it impacts your ability to be effective in the workplace, then the agency is really forced to take a look at how often is this happening and why is this having an impact on the staff.
Yeah, and Connie, I want to thank you for bringing that up. That is probably definitely one of the most important parts of our discussion is basically how does that affect you when you're exposed? Because that's why, we're victims, if that happens to us, because it's not the easiest thing to handle. As much as a lot of people think it is, it's not. I have seen the end result of when someone doing that and seeing staff shooken up by it. I've also seen the end result of charges that get thrown out when an inmate does it and how staff reacts to that. I mean, they don't feel safe anymore, especially if the exposure is like right by them. Imagine working in a dorm, open area. There's no barriers there. And you're walking, that inmate gets close to you and they're able to expose themselves. I mean, think about what else they could be able to do. It's a very scary situation that is, besides disrespectful, obviously disrespectful, but that's the least of it. It also could lead to something that, is one of the worst things to do to somebody. It really is the potential of where that to go. And I love how Connie mentioned how that could affect one's ability in doing their job. Connie, I'm sorry, Gary. Gary, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
I just want to say that Connie's absolutely right. She was in the courtroom there. She's thinking way ahead. Because what's one of the questions they're going to ask you? If it goes to trial, and even if it doesn't go to trial when you're doing your deposition, the question they're going to ask you is, how did that make you feel? So thanks, Connie. That was really good. I just want to tell everybody, stay safe, be careful, keep your head on the swivel, report these incidents, report these inmate threats. That's an inmate threat. Please report it. And management, if any management is listening anywhere out there, please back up your officers and help them prove to the inmates that this will not be tolerated.
I want you guys to know we usually have a fun atmosphere here, but we kept it serious as hell. Today's episode was serious. We did not joke. We just wanted to make sure that the message gets out there because, again, in the end, you ignoring it is not doing what needs to be done to prevent. And ultimately, this person's a risk. What are we doing to make sure they don't get out to society once they're released? Hey, Connie, anything you'd like to say in closing?
I would like to say that no matter what you think the agency's response will be to your report, still write it, right? Like, you never want it to be that you didn't come forward and report what you were experiencing and get help with what you were experiencing. You have always got to escalate the situation, especially before the inmates begin to escalate, because you haven't done what you needed to do to deter the behavior. You want to deter that behavior no matter what. And when those consequences come down, even if every time now, I think having those charges get thrown out, I think can be very hard for anyone to handle, so it's not being insensitive to that. But it's just saying, just don't give up on yourself. As those things continue to happen, you are the one who's being affected by it. And so you have to just continue writing. It is fighting that fight to make sure that change comes.
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing just in my thoughts for closing. Be strategic in your response. I can't explain that much. Response is going to be a response. Sometimes it's not safe to respond right away because this is a person that, especially in an open dorm, it's dangerous, but you're still going to respond. So I want you to know something. Be strategic in how you respond and make sure that when you do, you yourself are in a position that's protected and as safe and secured as possible. I mean, sometimes these predators want you to get close to them, so you better make sure that when you plan to do it, that you're not the only one, so I just want to make sure we get that out there. So again, just to sum up what we said, don't ignore, document, risk assessment for management, hopefully prosecution. But I think in the end, from all levels and from the tiers that we just mentioned, exhibition, whipping out your penis from inmates is just a behavior that we cannot tolerate. And it starts by us at the front line. And then once we start committing to our actions, it will force management to do the same. And then hopefully, like Gary mentioned, it would force those prosecutors to just make an example of one. Make an example of one. Find time. Find time to make an example of one. As always, guys, the show is Teared Up. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.